Oha, Haumatakiapi. My name is Elijah Hopkins, and I'm the Vice President of Student Services at Fort Pitt Community College. Today, we wanted to try something new. We have a new podcast series we're trying to develop called the Land-Based Learning Podcast Series. And so we wanted to take this time to do some outreach and to explore what land-based learning is from a tribal perspective, and kind of share some perspectives from some of the programming that we've been doing at Fort Pitt Community College, but also some of the partners that we have in different communities and different places. And so I reached out to Tahanshi, Jeremy Red Eagle. He's over in Tokanua, but maybe I'll let him introduce himself and then we'll kind of just visit in general terms about what land-based learning means to us, our experiences with it, because it really ties into everything. So if you're brand new to listening to this podcast series and land-based learning, we want to kind of share some information with you that hopefully will make an impact in your life, because we believe it comprises of like a physical, mental, spiritual health, and we just want to share some things with you. So Tahanshi, if you could just introduce yourself, that would be good.
Oh, Ametakiapi, Jeremy Redigal Makiapi. I live over here in Siston, South Dakota, or Tokanua, Enemy Swim, about 20 miles south of Siston. This is where I'm enrolled at. Moved here 10 years ago, but I grew up in Montana, kind of all over different places in Montana. And yeah, just happy to be here and kind of a subject that I'm passionate about. So we should have a pretty good conversations.
All right, Tahanshi. So yeah, like when we first came up with this idea of land-based learning, really this is I guess a English Washichu term for being indigenous, for being Dakota, Nakota, whatever your tribal affiliation is. And so it's just a segue to exploring our identity, because I believe that all of the different aspects of our tribal culture pre-reservation era, land-based learning was the way of life. And so we wanted to do our best to share some things that we're doing. And I honestly have no idea exactly where to start, other than um, the land itself. I want to say a few years back, or even back during when COVID hit. Okay, we part of my job at the college to do retention outreach services, and we started a thing called the Buffalo Chasers podcast series, and it was really good. A lot of people really liked it, and it was good to get in a virtual space and share things. But towards the end of that, as we started coming out of the COVID pandemic, it I was really like, I thought it was super important to share, to get beyond just virtual aspects and get into experiential, hands-on relationship with the land. And so I think we can do things like share things on these podcasts, but really, I want to steer students, community members, our family, our tioshpae, all those relationships that we have. I believe that the health and wealth of our people is going to be through experiential land-based learning. And so, every week we want to talk about different things, and I think our conversation might kind of like go all over the place, but we want anyone, regardless of age, your background. I think you guys can relate. And so I don't know about you, Tanshi, but one of the most, like, in recent memory, one of the things that we talked about and we participated was in um, Hehaka Wihidi. Like we did some elk hunting, and we really learned a lot. So that's just something we could talk about. But even at if we even stepping back, Tahashi, what do you think land-based learning means to you, and why is it important? Why is it something that community members should be a part of and incorporate? Because we live in such a digital world, man. I want our takojas, our children, to be thinking about that. So, Dokri Dukcha.
Yeah, I think for me, land-based teaching, when we talk about that, it's multifaceted. Like there's so many different, avenues that you could go down when talking about it. And like you said earlier, everything is connected, right? So for me, like the biggest thing today, the number one thing that's always at the forefront of my mind because I have grandchildren is climate change. And so I think that by having a connection to the land, we're going to be more aware of this, and it's going to help us to be able to combat this issue that we're faced with, because obviously society as a whole is not really doing anything about it, and it's going to have to come from the bottom up instead of the top down. So that's a huge thing for me. But me personally, going back looking at my childhood and how I was raised, land-based teachings, or just being connected to the land was like my foundation. And it wasn't because I wasn't raised like in a family where that was like a huge subject or something that was pursued. It was just naturally, my dad, my uncles, like everybody in our family, like hunting was a thing, right? And so looking back from the time that I was like my earliest memories, some of the very first memories I have being 4 or 5 years old was going hunting with my dad. And so that was something that even though I had like all these things that went on in my childhood that were not necessarily so positive, that was the one thing that I had that I could always lean on and look back on, was hunting, being in the outdoors, fishing, doing things like that. But at the same time, growing up, those things were kind of minimal in the sense that we can go so much deeper into these things because our people have been disconnected from it. People in general have been disconnected from the land and from those teachings and that way of living that are thousands of years old. And so now we're like rediscovering those things. And so as a young person, I had a lot of behavioral issues. I was kicked out of public school halfway through the seventh grade, all these different things that I had experienced. And now looking back on my life, had somebody gave me more guidance and gave me more instruction when it comes to being connected to the land, whether it's hunting, fishing, harvesting things, how to take care of the land, how things that we can do out there to make things to have a stronger connection to it, I think would have just saved me so many problems that I had in my own personal life. So now I look at my children and my grandchildren, and that's something that I want to provide for them. Is this knowledge that really is like you said, the experience of it, because we can read books, we can have elders, other people tell us and teach us things, but until you experience it, until you're out there like going through the process of what it takes to different styles and different ways of hunting different types of game, or harvesting different medicines or foods, and building a relationship with those things, that's when it becomes real. And so for me, I just think that that's really the answer for our young people. I think, me personally, this is my own opinion, a lot of people may not agree with it, but I'm kind of really anti um, Western education. I really believe that we need to rethink our educational system in this country as a whole, but definitely as Native people. And I believe that the land base, should be the foundation of that. That instead of having our kids in classrooms behind desks, we should have them outside getting exercise, breathing fresh air, learning about these, the stories and the language that's connected to the land, and the very land that our ancestors, lived on and relied on. And so I believe that that is the true, essence of land-based education, is to just get them reconnected to the land and the water.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I agree 100%. Like, how do we, I think people that are listening, I think part of the issue is access. And if, um, part of the college, the things that we do here is we share workshops, whether it's buffalo harvest, elk hunting opportunities, plant walks. But these are things that anyone can do. You don't even have to be connected to the college. Wherever you're at on Unchimaka, you got access to like get out and explore the world. And there's just so much connected, like you talked about earlier, Tashi. The language itself has been crafted through the land itself, the different dialects of the Dakota and the Assiniboine. And, and so, for example, when we did our elk hunt in the fall, even last year, I remember just getting out into the land and hiking. And then, even though technically we were doing an elk hunt, we were really the whole process. By the time we got out there, we were identifying plants along the way. Hey, haopi pejuta hecha, like wound medicine, and then those little stories that we share. You were sharing with me about your experiences with firefighting in the past. I think what that reinforced to me is it brought me back, like you're talking when we were younger, when you were hunting, maybe with your parents or your uncles or whoever. So like even with my father and my uncles, those are my earliest, most fond memories. And so that's what's going to stay with our children is giving them those access points. And then as we get, older, what is it that we're trying to share with our family? And I think part of that is sourcing our own foods, sourcing our own medicines, and having that direct relationship so that way when we're eating, we're promoting health. We know exactly where it comes from. I mean, just so many things are kind of like flooding my mind with that I think is important. So it's a good thing we're spreading this conversation out over weeks, but I guess at the end of the day, I think it's important for people to recognize that physical health, mental health, I guess your spiritual health, your emotional well-being, it's all connected to your relationship with the land. And so sometimes we have to get out and get that exercise and kind of reset, and then, like I think that was one of like the biggest things that whether you're camping, hunting, whatever it is, it's like nature has a way of pushing the reset button on your stress because we develop all these like anxiety and these social pressures from social media, work, all this stuff, man, and it drives our blood pressure through the roof. We're getting all these like, chronic diseases just as a people, especially in tribal country where it's like we're at the highest end of a lot of those not so good measures for health. And so I think as we're able to look at what we're doing, I think is that the one way that we kind of move the needle back to a place of health is just by getting out and connecting to the land. Um, yeah, and so like for example, I keep on reflecting on our the elk hunt, and I'm 44 years old, middle-aged hemachido. But when I was younger, as I get older, I'm learning, like with archery hunt where you have to get close to the animals. It's not about hunting from a truck. And maybe some people have to do that, because of limited physical ability. But that's an example when you're out archery hunting, you have to get out and walk. And I think it forces us to reconnect with the land and to connect with the animal that you're harvesting in a different way. So that was really eye-opening for me. Um, yeah, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that, but definitely towards the end of our discussion here, I want to share some other college updates as far as like a Buffalo roundtable discussion we're going to have later in January. I wanted people to be aware of that so they can maybe participate and share at a grassroots level their ideas on what buffalo herd management might look like for the Fort Peck tribes. And but again, this ties that all that stuff ties into land-based education because the buffalo, their health is determined by the land of itself and like the wild grasslands. And I know that's a kind of a subject that you're passionate about. So hopefully at some point during our discussion, either today or in the coming weeks, you could maybe share a little bit about that. That would be good.
Yeah, definitely. But I was just going back to what you were saying about like how, all these things are connected, the physical
Mm,
health, the mental, spiritual, emotional, all of those things. So this is to me, it takes me back personally to my own experiences as a teenager. And I battled with all those things. I battled with depression and anxiety and all of these, things that so many of our young people are up against today. And when I had to go to an alternative school. I it was about, yeah, halfway through the seventh grade was when I was kicked out of public school, and I always struggled in school, whether it was the academic side of it or the behavioral side of it. I just always struggled in school, and so I was put into a alternative like day treatment type of school. Went there for seventh and eighth grade, and I think part of ninth grade. And but one thing that they would do was, it was just different, right? It was alternative, so it wasn't your typical everyday sitting in a classroom. But the thing was, we went to school all year round,
Mm,
but they had started to implement this programming right about the time that I went there, that during the summer, instead of having us do, being stuck in the school building and doing the regular school hours, they changed it to where we would do 1 week of school and 1 week off, 1 week of school, 1 week off. But that week of school was, we would go backpacking, we would go on different trips that were, had to do with, being in the outdoors. Some of them were more simple, like just going to like Yellowstone and the Tetons, and camping in campgrounds and stuff like that. But the majority of them were actually like backpacking trips, where we would spend 5 days backpacking in the Anaconda Pintlers, the Italian Peaks, these different wilderness areas. We did float trips. We floated the Smith River. We floated the Missouri. And honestly, those are some of the best memories that I have throughout my life. And I just really, really remember that, like on the fourth, fifth day, Thursday night, Friday morning, where, because Friday would be the day that we would, backpack out, get to our vehicles, and go home. And I would just be like really depressed when it came to an end,
mm,
because I had nothing to look forward to go back home. There was no there was just nothing there other than trouble a lot of the times. So when I was out there, like, in these places that are like really, like, some of them were like a once in a lifetime opportunity, places that most people will never see or experience. But it just did something to me. It did something to me spiritually, emotionally, the physical part, of course, because you're out there, hiking or, doing whatever it is. And, but it did something for me. It really did. And I carried that throughout my life. And so I even attempted to recreate that for my children, taking them, I took them to a few of those places, as I became an adult, and wanted them to experience, what it's like to backpack into the mountains, to sleep out under the stars, to, challenge yourself to overcome fears or whatever it is. The physical part of it, hiking for miles on end while carrying a pack is, pretty tough to do. And so I think about that, and like today we see so many of our young people just sitting in, not just our kids, we are guilty of it, just sitting in front of a screen all the time, whether it's your phone, your iPad, whether it's for work or for pleasure or whatever. That is our go-to. That's what's educating our kids today. And I think that we don't even realize how much stress and anxiety that causes us in our life. And so to me, one of the only real true effective ways to do away with that is to be outside and to be present in the moment when you're out there on, in the mountains, out on the prairie, whatever it is you're doing. I just believe it's the answer to so many of the sicknesses and the diseases that we're dealing with today. And so the other part of that is our diet. And so, like, where I live, you can drive anywhere on this res, and even off the res, and we are surrounded by corn and soybean fields. And so when we look at our diet, we know that this is I was listening to a podcast out in Pine Ridge, and they brought up the subject of a food desert. And they were talking about this guy. I can't remember who it was, but he wasn't from there. They brought him out to do some work with their program, and they had used this word food desert. And he was like, I have a serious problem with that word. He goes, because as I was driving from Rapid City to Pine Ridge, he goes, I'm looking around and I'm seeing all of the valuable natural resources that we have. If you think about what our people ate pre-reservation, those things have been disrupted because of property, because of just different things, the progress that, through the Washichu side, that has limited the ability to some of those things. But at the same time, those things are still there. We still have elk, we still have deer, we still have, the prairie chickens and the grouse and the fish and the timsina and the berries. Like, all of those things still exist on our land. We have to do a lot of work to really bring them back to their full potential, but they're still here. The problem is that we have become disconnected from it. So when we say that we're in a food desert, it's because we don't have a nice, beautiful grocery store that you might find in the city. We have more of these, grocery stores that don't carry as good a high quality food. But the reality is, if we ourselves reconnect with the land and the food that the land provides, and we go back to that, those things are still there. And so it's a matter of us utilizing it and challenging ourselves to, stay away from processed foods and the things that we've really been raised on in our, is ingrained in us, that this is how we eat. And if we don't have access to those things, then we think that we're living in a food desert. When we do have the capabilities to grow our own gardens, our grandparents grew up that way. It's not that far removed from it. But we're living in a society where it's ingrained in us that, it's okay to eat out of a gas station or out of fast food, or, going out to restaurants, things like that. And then when we're at home, we're buying cheap food, because even those of us that have gotten ourselves out of the poverty in the sense of financially, we still have a poverty mindset. So we're still buying the cheaper foods because we've just been ingrained to do that for so long, instead of buying healthier options. So really challenging ourselves. I always say that if our land is sick, we're sick, because those things are connected. And so all of this agriculture that's going on around us, it is not sustainable in any way, shape, or form. And so we have to really start looking at that. What is food sovereignty? What does that entail? What does that look like? And because even myself, as somebody who, like, attempts to live this way and believe in this, even my own personal self, the percentage of the food that I eat that comes from harvesting, growing, anything that I've done from my own means, is really a small percentage of the overall food that I eat throughout the year. And I think that that's safe to say for anybody.
Yeah, no, I think we're all probably definitely guilty of that. And I mean, that's the one thing I do is I challenge myself and my family, um, basically to hold myself accountable to some of the goals, like it's one thing to be aware of it. If you're not aware, if you're ignorant of the facts, then, but when you are aware of what, some of the issues related to your health and your mental well-being and all that stuff, it's connected to our food and how we're sourcing it. And I'm even guilty myself of, doing some workshops, harvesting tips and adults, and it stays in our fridge or our freezers. And maybe once, maybe a week that we're actually eating it, as a family. And so, but slowly but surely, we're trying to do little things, man. I think incrementally, my goal is to have, as much possible organically sourced food, as much as that is possible. And it is tough, man. I think we just had a chili cook-off here yesterday at college, man, and I made this flyer and I was like, man, I didn't want to make it sound like you have to have wild game, but I wanted to encourage, buffalo, elk, moose, whatever it is, we encourage you to use that for your chili. And then, but some community members, man, as soon as they hear it's buffalo, deer, that they don't want nothing to do with it. But
Yeah.
part of that's a mindset, and part of it, my wife told me it like literally our palate has changed since we've been disconnected with buffalo going back to the 1800s. It only takes, I think she said, like one or two generations for your palate to change. But we can reverse that. That's something I think
Yeah.
that is possible. But I think you brought up some really good points. So when we talk about sourcing food, that's an educational process. And so like the other thing I encourage people, and I've been guilty of it too, is like, and part of that has to do with your mental health, whether it's depression or whatever, is that we feel guilty for not knowing, especially as tribal people, man. Like we all have like these identity issues, and some of us are like navigating our way back to who we really are. And so we're looking for things. And so, part of that is that what we're with education is what we're trying to share some personal experiences of what that might look like. Not pretending I'm still learning myself, but I think one of the best, I guess, pieces of advice that I could give, especially to my own children, grandchildren down the road, is to start sourcing your own food and then holding yourself accountable to eating it. And so even it's the little things like we had some elk meat, had some buffalo meat, grinded it up, and then so we're sliding that in the with our spaghetti once a week, man. And my kids can smell it too. They're like, "Dad, what is that?" Even my kids have been used to like smelling the beef and the hamburger for it when we put it in tacos, spaghetti, whatever. And so we're doing little things like that. At least once or twice a week, we try to put it in there with the idea being that more and more it's just more of a common thing. It's more natural instead of like, oh, we're eating indigenous, on every Friday. We want it to be like just a way of life, man. And at the college, we try to like source a lot of our food, and then we have events for our students and community members where it's like, how impactful is that? You as a student, community member, if you were part of the harvesting of plants, animals, then you learn to cook it, you learn to feed your constituents, your family members, and you eat it. Having an understanding of that whole cycle is really what I'm trying to be passionate about to share, is because it's not just like one aspect. You're gonna go hunt and then you're cultural, you're Indian. You know, really it's like establishing relationships, not with just the land and the animals, but with each other all over again. And I've seen such a huge impact, even just in the last few years, that I've really tried to push some of these like workshops where community members, not necessarily just students, but community members come together and they start talking about bappa making workshop. you know, they can come in. And so like a Kushi might come in and an auntie over here, different families will come together and they start sharing things. Whereas normally they weren't really talking in those ways, man, but they start reflecting like we're doing earlier in this discussion about, well, when I was young, my dad, did this, blah, blah. They would do the same things, but more from like the WIA perspective, and say my grandma, she used to do it like this and this. Next thing you know, they were laughing. I was just observing that at this workshop with my wife, and she was explaining that. And I think that's part of that, the socialization, renormalizing ourselves around how to harvest, doing it together and learning together, I think is the main thing. Um, but yeah, man, I think holding ourselves to be accountable is important. So
Yeah, I had last night. My Takoja was up here visiting. She's 7, and I was going through my phone and I found an old video that I had when she was probably 2.5, 3 years old, and we were at the kitchen table, and I was taking care of butchering a deer, and I was grinding some of it up, and she was sitting there helping me in this video. She's like taking my hand and putting it on her so she could, turn the grinder, and but it's, so then and I'm just realizing like she's so curious and so helpful and so interested in anything that we as parents and grandparents, we can, kind of steer that for them, like pushing them in certain directions. And so taking her out, and we she talks about Timsina because I've taken her out to harvest, and we talk about different foods and different plants, and so that becomes a part of her upbringing. It becomes a part of who she is and her identity. And we, are so disconnected from these things today that we have to create that. We have to be intentional with creating those settings for our kids. And so like this is a common thing, and I think most people would agree with this when we talk about our traditional foods, specifically like wasna, chayaka, different things like that. In today's world, it is so common where the only time that we ever see those things is either
ceremony.
at ceremony or funerals, when
Mm.
in reality, that was everyday food for our people. So reconditioning ourselves that this isn't ceremony food. Yeah, there is a part that of it that belongs at ceremony, but it really just belongs in our home every day, and we need to get used to reconnecting with that diet.
I've heard that a lot over here in Fort Peck too, man. I think like visiting with people about things that we're doing, just sharing information. And I hear these little oh, that's ceremony food. That's ceremony. It could be, but it's used in ceremony, but it's still food. And who says that we can't eat it during any other time of the year in the common settings, and whether that's we talked about this before during our hunting trip, is like how cool would that be is to source our own food, prepare our own ingredients to make wasna and use it during a hunting trip as like the ultimate like Tatanka snack bar, man, is like to do it ourselves. That's really should be a goal. And I think that's something anybody could do. And we don't want people to think it's just in ceremonies or just when you go to a tribal college workshop, you're going to eat this or whatever. It's just like people can do it for themselves whenever they can.
Yeah.
But, and I remember even the little things, man, I think when you look back 2, 3 generations ago, definitely pre-reservation era. You look at the pictures of the Ehana, Dakota, Nakota people, all tribal peoples, like everyone was lean and mean, man. None of this obesity. People might have been a little heavier set, but that's just because they were, that was their disposition. But there was no morbid obesity. It just wasn't a thing. Now we kind of normalize it and people like to joke about it all the time. Like, you know, it's like a punchline. And so we've even normalized that to make fun of it, and it's like, and it's just common to see even young children that are, that have such like poor eating habits that it's something that's totally reversible, and I think through connecting with just simple things and exercise and food, like it'll change the state of mind. And like, but I even remember my dad, we were talking one time, his grandpa Abel Hopkins, they were driving down the road and here they found an elk on the side of the road. So he told my dad, pull over, pull over. So he pulled over and here and it was a roadkill, but it was pretty fresh. So they picked it up, threw it in the back of the truck. He said, don't tell anybody we found this alongside the road. So they took it home and they were, eating like kings, man. So but it was that mentality that, nothing goes to waste. And if it's fresh, meat like that, we might as well use it, And so now it's like, it's just funny. I mean, not funny. It's just kind of sad when I see like people that do not want to eat wild game. I mean,
Yeah.
they're so used to beef and like, I mean, every once in a while I'm guilty of it too. Like, but at the same time, it's like people just have to make a decision. It's a conscious choice to like start integrating um, organically sourced foods, I guess. And I even have struggled with what is organic, man. Like I think people fall into these pitfalls of I'm gonna go to Whole Foods and if it has organic on the label, I'm gonna throw it in, I'm off the hook. Like I don't agree with that either, man. It's like it probably is somewhat better for you, but at the same time, like if you're stuck in a city and that's what you got to do out of convenience, but we have to make spaces and times to like start harvesting. And so I think that's part of this discussion too, is like what I'd like to see, and I know you have like, expert knowledge in this and just in your background, but like I want people to have no experience, I guess the younger people or anybody really of any age, regardless of your age, is that there's like a cyclical cycle that we have to be in tune with to harvest, to prepare those things. And it never ends, man. So like when people say we're in like a food desert, well, that's because you were probably not preparing when the choke cherries were ready or when the the walleye were spawning or whatever. I mean, all that stuff's a part of it.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned COVID earlier, and that to me was like a huge because even though I'm passionate about these things and I've attempted to live this way, we get caught up in life, man. We get caught up with, work and bills and, all of these things. And so COVID to me was like the positive side of it, the blessing to it was because we live out in the country when everything was shut down and we weren't going to work and doing these things, we didn't just stay cooped up in the house. I took my kids and we were outside. That was probably the most hunting I ever did in my life was during COVID because I could hunt every single day. We went out and dug Timsina and the berries and all of those things. And so one thing, because we talk about teachings, whether it's, somebody sitting down and, sharing things with you, or picking up a book and reading a book, right? Like we can learn, we gather information through that, but I don't look at it as true knowledge, right? Like it's just information. But when it becomes true knowledge is when you have the experience to go with it, right? So during COVID, I'm taking my kids, and then they're not resisting it because they want to get out of the house and there's nowhere else to go, nothing else to do. So they're more than happy to come dig Timsina or do whatever during that time. But it dawned on me, because of these stories and different things that elders, have shared with me. Ishina Joe Williams, who's no longer here with us, but I spent a lot of time with him. And he would tell this Unkto story about the bear and the female bear, and she had two cubs, and they were, being bears, right? Like bears know, because they hibernate through the winter. So as soon as winter is over, they're already preparing for the next winter, doing everything that they need to do to have what they need to be able to sustain them. But one of those little bear cubs, Unktomi, like befriends him, and they're just out goofing off all the time, doing whatever, and then here comes wintertime, and this little bear cub is not like where it should be physically, with the food and the fat and all of that to get it through the winter. And just a real simple, basic little story. But I remember him clearly telling me, as soon as winter is done, you start preparing for the next winter. That's how harsh winters were, for our people that lived on the plains and, lived in the lodges and things like that. So when during that COVID time, because I'm out there on the land and actually having time from, spring all the way until fall, to actually have that lived experience, and realizing that all of these berries, all of these plants, whether they were for food or medicine, they come in stages. It's everything doesn't bloom and blossom at one time, so you start in June, even before that, even in May, you have certain plants that appear, and then those ones die off, and then the next ones come and they ripen and they're ready, and that goes all the way into to fall time, and then once you reach that point, it becomes hunting season. And it was just like, because I think about back in the day how they lived, you would be overwhelmed if your choke cherries and your June berries and all the other berries and the timsina and everything was ripe at
All
the
the
same
same
time.
time.
you
Yeah.
wouldn't you wouldn't be able to go and do your be effective with harvesting all of those things. So mother nature provides in the fashion of what we need. And so you, as long as you are busy and being industrious during that entire time, and also it goes back to those shared roles between males and females, then you are able to gather and collect all of that food, and because then you have to put in the work of preparing it, drying it, or whatever you're doing to it. And then comes into hunting season, and hunting season is the same way. You have different animals. Elk go into the rut before the deer do. And then of course we know as hunters that those are the prime times to hunt those animals. So it's just really stopping and paying attention and listening to what the land is providing us. I've heard other elder tell me, when you have a year when there's a lot of timsina, maybe more than normal, you take advantage of that. You harvest, all of that. And when there's very little of something, maybe you leave it alone. And then the next year those things will come back. But you have to be in tune with it. So one thing that happened during COVID was everybody wanted to be out there doing those things, which is good, right? Because we want our people to reconnect with this. But then the downside of that is, if we're not paying attention, if we're not educating ourselves in the process of doing this, we're we have to be mindful that we live in a different time. So here, and I know Montana is similar, but it's even more so here, where we're a checkerboard reservation, but we also have, this land that's been dug up, because of agriculture, because of development. And so Timsina doesn't grow just anywhere. It grows in the natural prairie, but the natural prairie is just in a select few spots now. So if you have an influx of, our people going back, and for one, we have higher population nowadays than what our people did, back in the 17 and 1800s. And back then they had, limitless land that they could, harvest. Today it's the reverse, where we have very small patches of land that we can utilize to harvest foods and medicines, and we have an influx in our population. And then we are disconnected from the methods and the time, like when is it appropriate to go and harvest Timsina or anything else, so that it's beneficial for the land and that it's going to come back, the following year. So if we're not educated in that, you're going to get all these people that are going to the same spots to harvest Timsina, and we may not feel it right away, but within in the next generation, it's going to impact us unless we use our minds to come together to figure out ways to sustain the land. And that is a huge subject in itself, because what I've learned about the prairie is that our people actually created the prairie. This wasn't something that just Mother Nature did on its own. It was because of our intimate relationship with the land and the animals that we actually helped to create the ecosystems that we live in and to sustain those ecosystems. So our people were intentional about keeping a prairie ecosystem because it was how we survived. We knew that the buffalo and the elk and all of these animals, the medicines, all these things provided for us. So today, I see our land here turning into woodland because we are no longer utilizing fire. We're no longer utilizing our traditional harvesting practices, even if it's just gathering firewood. Like there's a traditional way of doing that and a modern way of doing that. So how do we reconnect ourselves to those methods of, just being a part of the land,
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, I know you make some good points. Like even I was wanting to mention this. I definitely at some point in our discussion down the road. Um, but for example, it was just I've heard different elders use different terms for it, the code we cho tawachin, or it's the Dakota mentality, right? But I see that as an issue, even those that are aware that they want to, especially post-pandemic, you know, identify the plants, medicines. This would apply to hunting practices, is that there's this almost like overconsumption mentality, or it's just like, I don't like to say that they're being greedy. I don't know if it's just a lack of ignorance or what, but it's only take what you need. And I think some people, they might toe that line. Some of them just do it just because they don't know any better. Maybe that's the way they were taught. But I think part of our responsibility, how I look at it with myself, is to share it not in a shaming way, but just say, hey, this is like we're talking conservation. This is where we probably do have to integrate maybe some Western practices on how to save and work with the land, best practices, as far as like how to maintain forests, land, different things like that. But just what I've noticed is that if you let some people run amok, there's a possibility, like you're alluding to, is that they could devastate the ecosystem to the point where some of those medicines just don't come back. Some of the animals just don't come back. And so at that point, whether it's a reintroduction of certain species or whatever, like with this Buffalo Roundtable discussion, that's one of the things that we're looking at is if the land isn't being taken care of, how does that affect and impact buffalo health? And if we're all about taking care of the buffalo as our relatives, then we have to like look at what they're eating and different their habitat. And so yeah, there's definitely a lot to it, Tahanshi. I think we're probably gonna have to wrap it up because I have some more obligations to attend to here. But as far as our first kickoff podcast series for the land-based learning series, is there any other comments you want to close up with before we wrap it up today, Tashi?
Yeah, I'm just going to go off of what you were just talking about there real quick, because um this she's a non-native lady, but I learned a lot from her. She had purchased this land right off the res here, and it was a natural prairie that had not been disturbed, and so her whole goal was to kind of make it healthy again. Because even if it's left alone, right, that doesn't necessarily make it healthy because
Mm.
you can have invasive species and other things that come in there. So anyway, she did this work. Man, I learned a lot from her, you know, a whole lot. But even her, she was like, because when we talk about that Dakota way of thinking, right, like some of these prairie restoration, natural, you know, nature conservancy, all these, a lot of them, even though they're good intentions, sometimes they come with it from a linear way of thinking sometimes. And so one of the things that she was big on was like she was really like she would she would cringe when she would like see Facebook posts of our people out digging Timpson up, because she's just like, there's so little of the prairie left, and you got, you know, and blah blah blah, all this stuff. And so like she would refuse, like she would never let anybody go out to her 500 acres to harvest Timpson up. And not that I don't blame her for that, but I said at the same time, I believe through a Dakota way of thinking, there has to be a balance that we have to be utilizing these things. We have to be reconnecting with it. We can't go in and wipe these things out. We can't go out and over harvest. You know, we have to be very intentional with how we do it, but we need to be doing it because on a spiritual level, I believe that we're letting those plants, we're letting those relatives know that we need them and that we're utilizing them. You know, so it's
Mm.
not to discourage people from going out and doing these things. It's be intentional about it, be thoughtful of it, ask questions, research, look into it, because you know the spiritual and the science, there has to be a balance. You know, I think in a Dakota worldview there is no separation of those things, that those things are one, but in the Washichu world those things are separate.
Mhm.
You know, so that's my outlook on those things. Be intentional, be out there, gain the experience, get out. It's just like the elk hunting, right? You can listen to podcasts and read elk hunting magazines all day long and you can have all the best gear, but until you're out there experiencing it, that's when that knowledge becomes real. And you're going to make mistakes and do things along the way, but in that process we're going to learn and we're going to reconnect with those old teachings that then we're going to be able to pick that up and be able to start passing that on to our children and grandchildren, like it should have been done this entire time without that interruption there. So it's, we're in
Mm.
that point in our lives where we just have to figure these things out and continue to move forward with it.
Mm. Yeah, well said, Tanshi. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Henak Shado, Dokshta Tanshi.
Oh, don't stop it.